Welcome to Myths of the Night. Ancient stories told in whispers to guide you into calm and peaceful rest. Here, the myths of old are retold in calm voices to help you rest, reflect, and dream. In the realm where gods and mortals intertwine, where divine caprice shapes human destiny, there exists a love story so profound that it has echoed through the centuries, inspiring poets, artists, and dreamers alike. This is the tale of Eros and Psyche, a story that speaks to the very essence of what it means to love, to trust, and to transform through the trials that love inevitably brings. It is a story of impossible beauty and jealous gods, of darkness and revelation, of tasks that test the limits of devotion, and ultimately, of a love so powerful that it transcends the boundaries between mortal and divine. Unlike many Greek myths that come to us through fragments and various retellings, the story of Eros and Psyche arrives primarily through a single, magnificent source. In the 2nd century of the Common Era, a North African writer and philosopher named Apuleius crafted an extraordinary novel called the Metamorphoses, more commonly known as the Golden Ass. This work stands as the only complete Roman novel in Latin to survive from antiquity, and nestled within its pages, occupying roughly a fifth of the entire work, lies the enchanting tale that concerns us tonight. Apuleius was no ordinary storyteller. Born in Numidia, in what is now Algeria, around 124 of the Common Era, he was a man of considerable learning, deeply influenced by Platonic philosophy and the mystery religions that flourished throughout the Mediterranean world. His novel follows the misadventures of a man named Lucius, who, through an unfortunate magical mishap, finds himself transformed into a donkey. During his trials in this animal form, Lucius overhears many stories, but none as captivating as the tale of Eros and Psyche, told by an old woman to comfort a kidnapped bride. The story begins, as all good fairy tales do, with a royal family in an unnamed kingdom. This deliberate vagueness gives the tale a universal quality, allowing it to belong to all times and all places. In this kingdom lived a king and queen blessed with 3 daughters. The 2 eldest daughters possessed beauty that drew appropriate admiration, the kind of loveliness that mortal women might reasonably claim. Their beauty inspired compliments and turned heads, certainly, but it remained firmly within the realm of human achievement. But the youngest daughter, whose name was Psyche, possessed something altogether different. Her beauty transcended the ordinary categories by which mortals judged such things. Ancient writers struggled to describe her appearance adequately, for human language seemed too poverty-stricken to capture the radiance that emanated from her very being. The name Psyche itself carries profound significance. In ancient Greek, Psyche means both soul and butterfly, creating layers of symbolism that would unfold throughout her story. Imagine, if you will, the effect this extraordinary beauty had upon those who beheld it. Travelers from distant lands began making pilgrimages to catch even the briefest glimpse of this remarkable princess. They would arrive in crowds, pressing through the palace gates, assembling in the courtyards and gardens, hoping for a moment when Psyche might appear. And when she did, these witnesses to perfection would press their right hands to their lips, touching thumb to forefinger in that ancient gesture of worship, as if they stood before a goddess rather than a mortal woman. Word of Psyche's beauty spread like wildfire across the ancient world. Merchants carried tales of her along trade routes. Sailors spoke of her in distant ports. Pilgrims journeyed hundreds of miles just to stand outside her father's palace. And as the crowds grew, as the worship intensified, these admirers began to speak of her not merely as beautiful, but as divine. Some whispered that she must be Aphrodite herself, descended to walk among mortals. Others claimed she was an earthly manifestation of the goddess of love and beauty, born to remind humanity of divine perfection. The religious devotion that should have flowed to Aphrodite's temples began to redirect itself toward this mortal girl. The sacred precincts dedicated to the goddess of love, once bustling with worshippers bearing offerings of flowers, perfumes, and prayers, fell silent and abandoned. The altars that had blazed with perpetual flames grew cold, covered with dead ashes. Sculptors who had once crafted countless images of Aphrodite now found no commissions for such work. The garlands that should have decorated the goddess's statues wilted, untouched, while fresh flowers were cast at Psyche's feet. For Psyche herself, this adoration brought no joy whatsoever. In fact, her situation grew increasingly tragic with each passing day. Men would journey from across the known world to gaze upon her beauty, to worship her from afar. But not one of them thought to court her as a potential bride. They admired her as one might admire a perfect statue or a sublime sunset, something too elevated for mere mortal interaction. The very beauty that drew thousands to her door simultaneously erected an invisible barrier between Psyche and any possibility of human connection. Her two sisters, possessing more ordinary charms, had long since married well. Each had wedded kings, celebrated their unions with elaborate ceremonies, and departed to begin their own lives and families. But Psyche remained in her father's palace, isolated by the very quality that others envied. She was like a beautiful artifact locked away in a shrine, admired but never touched, worshipped but never truly known. The loneliness that accompanied her supernatural beauty must have weighed heavily upon her heart. She longed not for adoration from distant crowds, but for genuine affection, for the intimate knowledge of being truly seen and loved as a woman, rather than idolized as an icon. As Psyche suffered in her gilded isolation, another drama was unfolding in the celestial realms above. Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, had become aware of this mortal usurper who was stealing her rightful worship. The goddess had emerged from the sea foam near the island of Cyprus, born from the severed genitals of the sky god Uranus, when his son Cronus had cast them into the waves. From her very first moments of existence, Aphrodite had embodied physical perfection and sexual allure. Her beauty was her domain, her power, her very essence. Now, to have that fundamental aspect of her identity challenged by a mere mortal filled her with volcanic rage. Aphrodite's temples stood empty while crowds thronged to glimpse Psyche. Aphrodite's altars grew cold while flowers piled at a mortal girl's feet. The goddess who had inspired the judgment of Paris, who had promised him Helen of Troy in exchange for the golden apple declaring her the fairest, found herself eclipsed by someone who lacked even a single drop of divine ichor in her veins. The insult cut deeper than simple vanity. In the ancient world, gods derived their power in part from worship and recognition. When mortals ceased to honor a deity, that god's influence diminished. The abandoned temples represented not just wounded pride, but an actual threat to Aphrodite's cosmic authority. Moreover, the goddess had seen countless mortals over the millennia, and she knew that humans who received honors beyond their station inevitably grew arrogant, committing the sin of hubris that the gods punished most severely. Aphrodite seethed with indignation. She paced the halls of her underwater palace, her fury building like a storm tide. Finally, she summoned her son, Eros, the god of love and desire. In later traditions, Eros would be depicted as the chubby cherub we recognize as Cupid, a mischievous infant with wings. But in earlier Greek thought, and in Apuleius's telling, Eros appeared as a stunningly beautiful young man in the prime of youth, powerful and dangerous, bearing the golden bow and arrows that could make any being, mortal or divine, fall helplessly in love. Eros had always been his mother's instrument, her weapon for enforcing her will upon both gods and mortals. His arrows had caused countless tragedies and comedies, bringing together mismatched pairs, inspiring forbidden passions, and generally creating chaos in service to his mother's whims or his own amusement. Aphrodite knew she could rely on his power and his obedience, or so she believed. Standing before her son, Aphrodite's words dripped with venom as she described the situation. This mortal girl, this shameless creature called Psyche, had dared to accept worship that rightfully belonged to the goddess. The people had forsaken Aphrodite's divinity in favor of flesh and blood beauty. Such blasphemy could not stand. Aphrodite commanded her son to fly down to the mortal realm and use his arrows to make Psyche fall desperately, hopelessly in love with the most wretched, despicable, hideous man that walked the earth. Let her beauty be her curse, the goddess declared. Let her be bound forever to someone so vile that her legendary loveliness would be wasted, a cosmic joke for the gods' amusement. Eros listened to his mother's instructions and agreed to carry out her wishes. He took up his bow and his quiver, filled with those golden arrows that had toppled kingdoms and driven the mighty to madness with desire. He spread his magnificent wings and descended from the heavens toward the mortal realm, toward the palace where Psyche dwelt in her lonely magnificence. The god of love came to her chamber while she slept, moving invisibly through the darkness. He approached her bed, his arrows ready, his mission clear in his mind. But then, as he drew closer, as the moonlight streaming through the window illuminated her sleeping face, Eros made a crucial error. In his eagerness, or perhaps in his carelessness, he leaned too close, and one of his own arrows pricked his flesh. The effect was instantaneous and irreversible. Eros, who had caused countless others to fall in love, found himself struck by his own weapon. As Psyche stirred in her sleep, as her eyes briefly opened and seemed to look directly at where the invisible god stood, Eros felt his heart pierced by a desire more powerful than any he had ever known or inflicted upon others. In that single moment, the god of love fell utterly, completely, desperately in love with the mortal girl his mother had sent him to curse. This accident changed everything. Eros could not carry out Aphrodite's vengeful command. He could not condemn Psyche to a life of misery with some repulsive partner. But neither could he reveal to his mother that he had fallen in love with the very mortal she despised. Eros found himself trapped between filial duty and passionate desire, between his mother's wrath and his own overwhelmed heart. The god of love devised a plan, though it required deception on a cosmic scale. He flew to his fellow deity, Apollo, the god of prophecy, light, and truth, who presided over the famous oracle at Delphi. Eros must have been very persuasive, for he convinced Apollo to deliver a specific prophecy when Psyche's father inevitably consulted the oracle about his daughter's unmarried state. Back in the mortal realm, Psyche's parents had indeed grown desperate. Years had passed, and still their youngest daughter remained unwed despite her extraordinary beauty. Her father, the king, feared that his family had somehow offended the gods. What other explanation could there be for such an unnatural situation? Beautiful daughters were supposed to make advantageous marriages, not languish in perpetual maidenhood. Concerned and confused, the king made the journey to Delphi to consult Apollo's oracle about Psyche's fate. The oracle, that sacred priestess who breathed the intoxicating vapors rising from the earth's depths and spoke the will of Apollo, delivered a prophecy that struck terror into the king's heart. Psyche, the oracle proclaimed, was not destined for any mortal man. Her husband awaited her on a lonely mountain peak, a creature so terrible that even the gods themselves feared him. This beast, this monster, possessed wings that allowed it to fly through the heavens, and its power exceeded that of any divine being. The king must prepare his daughter as a bride, dress her in funeral garments, and lead her in a procession to the appointed cliff, where she must be left alone to meet her dreadful fate. The prophecy's language was deliberately ambiguous. In Greek, the word used could mean either a terrible monster or a powerful, divine being. The oracle spoke in riddles, as oracles always did, describing Eros himself, but in terms that suggested horror rather than divinity. It was true that Eros possessed wings. It was true that his power over love made him feared even by gods, for no one was immune to his arrows. But the prophecy packaged these truths in language designed to inspire dread. The king returned home bearing this devastating news. Imagine the grief that must have filled the palace when he revealed what the oracle had pronounced. Psyche's mother wept. Her father raged against the injustice of the gods. The entire kingdom prepared to mourn their beloved princess, for the prophecy seemed like nothing less than a death sentence. What monster awaited their girl on that distant peak? What horror would befall her in that lonely, wind-swept place? Psyche herself received the news with remarkable composure. Perhaps she had grown so weary of her isolated existence that even a terrible fate seemed preferable to the living death of being worshipped but never loved. Or perhaps she possessed a courage born of desperation, a willingness to face whatever destiny the gods had decreed, rather than continue her purposeless existence. She told her grieving parents not to weep for her now. They should have mourned, she said, when crowds first began worshiping her as a goddess. That was when she truly died, when her humanity was stripped away by excessive adoration. The day of her wedding funeral arrived. The entire city participated in the procession, but instead of joyful celebration, the air was thick with lamentation. Psyche was dressed in bridal garments, but garments suitable for a funeral. She wore a veil, but it was dark and heavy, rather than light and celebratory. Torches were lit, but their flames guttered and smoked rather than burning bright. The wedding hymns sung were dirges. Every element of celebration was inverted, transformed into its mourning opposite. The procession wound its way through the city and out into the wild lands beyond, climbing higher and higher until they reached the appointed cliff. There, on that desolate summit, where the wind howled and no shelter could be found, Psyche's parents and the accompanying citizens left her. They had no choice. To disobey an oracle was to invite even worse divine punishment. So with tears streaming down their faces, with hearts breaking in their chests, they abandoned the beautiful girl to her unknown fate and made their sorrowful way back down the mountain. Psyche stood alone on that windswept height as the last echoes of the funeral procession faded into the distance. She faced her fate with whatever courage she could muster, waiting for the monster to appear. But instead of terror descending from the skies, Psyche felt the gentlest breeze begin to stir around her. This was no ordinary wind. It was Zephyrus, the west wind, and it wrapped around her with supernatural gentleness, lifting her from the rocky summit as easily as a leaf is carried on an autumn day. The wind bore her through the air, and rather than the violent, terrifying flight she might have expected, the journey felt almost soothing. Zephyrus carried her away from the barren cliff, over valleys and forests, until they came to a meadow of extraordinary beauty. The grass here grew thick and soft, dotted with wild flowers in every color. A gentle stream murmured nearby, and there, at the center of this enchanted place, stood a palace that took Psyche's breath away. No human hands had built this structure. That much was immediately clear. The architecture was too perfect, too impossible. The walls seemed to be constructed of precious stones that glowed with their own inner light. Columns of marble supported roofs tiled in gold and silver. Gardens surrounded the palace, filled with trees that bore both flowers and fruit simultaneously, where the air itself seemed to shimmer with magic. Psyche approached the palace on trembling legs, her fear gradually giving way to wonder. She crossed the threshold, and the interior proved even more magnificent than the exterior suggested. Halls stretched away in every direction, each more beautifully appointed than the last. Tapestries, woven with threads of gold and silver, hung on the walls. Sculptures of perfect craftsmanship stood in alcoves. Everywhere she looked, she saw treasures that would make kings weep with envy. Yet there was no lock on any door, no guard at any entrance, no chains protecting these countless riches. More strange still, she saw no people. The palace stood empty and silent, though clearly maintained in perfect condition. As Psyche wandered through the halls, marveling at this impossible place, a voice spoke. It had no body, no visible source, yet it was clear and kind. The voice told her not to be afraid. Everything here belonged to her now. This palace, these treasures, all of it was hers to command. The voice and others like it belonged to invisible servants who would attend to her every need. She should retire to her chambers, the voice suggested. There she would find a bath drawn, fresh clothing laid out, and when she was ready, a feast would be prepared. Psyche did as the voice suggested. She found the bedchamber more luxurious than anything she had ever known in her father's palace. She bathed in water perfumed with oils, washing away the dust of her strange journey. She dressed in garments of silk softer than clouds. And when she emerged, she found a banquet laid out in the dining hall, every dish a masterpiece, every flavor perfect. As she ate, invisible musicians played. She could hear the lyre, the flute, pipes and drums, all creating harmonies more beautiful than any mortal orchestra could produce. Singers with voices like angels sang songs that brought tears to her eyes. And through it all, the invisible servants attended to her needs, though she never saw a single one of them. When night fell and exhaustion finally claimed her, Psyche retired to the magnificent bed in her chamber. She lay in the darkness, her mind reeling with the strangeness of everything that had happened. The monster the oracle had promised had not appeared. Instead, she found herself in paradise, attended by invisible servants, surrounded by unimaginable luxury. What did it all mean? As she lay there in the darkness, she heard footsteps approaching. Someone entered the chamber, though she could see nothing in the pitch black of the moonless night. a presence settled onto the bed beside her, and then a voice spoke. It was masculine, warm, gentle. The voice introduced himself as her husband, the one she had been destined to marry. He told her that she must never attempt to see his face. This was the one condition of their union, the single rule she must never break. He would come to her every night under cover of darkness. They would speak, they would share intimacies, they would build a relationship in the shadows. But she must never light a lamp, never seek to discover his identity. If she could accept this condition, they would be happy together. If she violated this trust, she would lose everything. Psyche listened to this strange condition, and something in his voice reassured her. There was no cruelty there, no menace. The voice belonged to someone who sounded kind, intelligent, passionate. She agreed to his terms. And so began the most unusual marriage in all of mythology. Night after night, Eros would come to her in darkness. They would talk for hours, sharing thoughts and dreams, hopes and fears. Their conversations ranged across every subject. She found him witty and wise, considerate and passionate. And though she could not see him, though she had only his voice and his touch to know him by, Psyche began to fall deeply in love with her mysterious husband. Their physical intimacy deepened as well. In the darkness, without sight to guide them, they learned to know each other through touch alone, through the language of bodies intertwined. The love they made carried an intensity heightened by the absence of vision, by the heightened awareness of every other sense. Psyche had never imagined that love could be like this, so complete, so consuming, despite the veil of darkness that lay between them. Days in the palace passed in pleasant leisure. Psyche wandered the magnificent halls, explored the gardens, listened to her invisible servants singing as they worked. She wanted for nothing material. The palace provided every comfort, every luxury. Yet as weeks turned to months, a different kind of longing began to grow in her heart. She missed her family. The thought of her parents, believing her dead or worse, tormented her. Her sisters must surely think her devoured by the monster of the prophecy. The isolation of the palace, however golden, began to feel like another kind of cage. She had traded the loneliness of being worshipped for the loneliness of being cut off from everyone she had known before. One night, as Eros held her in the darkness, Psyche gathered her courage and made a request. Would it be possible, she asked, for her sisters to visit? She longed to see them, to reassure them that she was alive and well. She promised that she would tell them nothing of her husband's identity, that she would obey the condition of darkness. She simply needed to see her family again. to feel that human connection she so desperately missed. Eros was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of concern, even fear. He warned her that her sister's visit would bring danger. They might not react to her good fortune with the happiness she hoped for. Jealousy could poison their hearts. They might plant seeds of doubt in her mind, encourage her to break the very rule that protected their happiness. He begged her to reconsider, but Psyche persisted. Her pleading grew more passionate, more desperate. She could not bear the thought of her family suffering on her account. Finally, reluctantly, Eros gave in to her wishes. He would permit the visit, though everything in him rebelled against the idea. He instructed her to tell her sisters nothing about him, to resist any suggestions they might make, to trust in him and in the love they shared. The next morning, Zephyrus carried Psyche's two sisters from the cliff where she had been abandoned to the meadow where the palace stood. The reunion was joyful at first. The sisters embraced Psyche with tears and exclamations of relief. They had mourned her as dead, they said. They had wept for weeks, convinced the monster had destroyed her. To find her alive filled them with happiness. But as Psyche showed them through the palace, as they saw the treasures that surrounded her, as they understood the life of luxury she now led, something darker began to stir in the sisters' hearts. They had married kings, true, but their palaces were crude compared to this impossible magnificence. Their jewels were paste beside these gems. Their servants were clumsy mortals, not invisible spirits who anticipated every need. And their husbands, well, their husbands were ordinary men, growing old and fat, their passion long since cooled to comfortable habit. The sisters began to ask questions. Who was this husband of Psyche's? What manner of man commanded such wealth and power? Surely Psyche must be the most fortunate woman alive to have won the heart of such an extraordinary being. They pressed her for details, their questions growing more insistent, more probing. Psyche, remembering her promise to Eros, deflected as best she could. She told them that her husband was a young man who spent his days hunting in the mountains. She showered them with gifts, beautiful things from the palace's inexhaustible treasures, and sent them home with Zephyrus's assistance, hoping that the visit had satisfied their curiosity. But the sisters left the palace seething with jealousy. Why should Psyche, the youngest, have such good fortune? Why should she, who had always drawn more attention with her beauty, now also possess greater wealth and a more mysterious, intriguing husband? It wasn't fair. It wasn't right. Something had to be done. The sisters schemed together, crafting a wicked plan. When they visited again, invited by Psyche's continuing loneliness, they came armed with lies designed to prey on her insecurities and natural curiosity. They reminded her of the oracle's prophecy. Had she forgotten? They asked, with false concern, that she was meant to marry a terrible monster. This mysterious husband who would not show his face, who came only in darkness. What was he hiding? The sisters painted horrible pictures with their words. Surely her husband must be the serpent the oracle had described, they insisted. He was probably hideous, deformed, monstrous. He hid his true appearance because he knew that if Psyche saw him in the light, she would flee in terror. And worse, they said, their voices dropping to horrified whispers. They had heard from soothsayers that this serpent planned to let Psyche grow fat with child before devouring both mother and baby in a single terrible feast. These lies found fertile ground in Psyche's mind because of the very condition Eros had imposed. The secrecy, the darkness, the prohibition against seeing his face, all of it suddenly seemed sinister rather than mysterious. Why would he hide himself unless he had something terrible to conceal? Doubt, that most corrosive of emotions, began to eat away at her trust. Her sisters pressed their advantage. They told her what she must do. That very night, she should prepare a lamp and hide it near the bed. She should also take a sharp knife. When her husband fell asleep, she should light the lamp and look upon his true form. If he proved to be the monster they suspected, she must have the courage to strike, to cut off the serpent's head and free herself from this dangerous enchantment before it was too late. After her sisters departed, Psyche spent the day in terrible internal conflict. One part of her rejected their accusations completely. Her husband had been nothing but kind, loving, passionate. The voice she knew, the touch she had learned to love, belonged to someone gentle and good. How could such a person be a monster? But another part of her, the part that had always been curious, that had longed to truly know the person she loved, seized upon the sisters' words as justification. Why shouldn't she look upon her husband? What marriage could be complete when half of it remained literally invisible? Trust was important, certainly, but so was knowledge. So was the full intimacy of seeing and being seen. By the time night fell, Psyche had made her decision. She prepared everything as her sisters had instructed. She hid an oil lamp near the bed, its flame ready to be revealed at the right moment. She placed a sharp knife within reach. And when Eros arrived, and they made love with their usual passion, when he fell asleep afterward in her arms, she waited for his breathing to deepen into the rhythms of complete unconsciousness. Then, with trembling hands, she reached for the lamp. She uncovered its flame, casting light for the first time on the face of her mysterious husband. And what she saw in that golden glow made her gasp aloud, made her hand shake so violently that the lamp nearly fell from her grasp. There was no monster. There was no serpent. There was no hideous deformity or terrifying beast. Instead, lying asleep in her bed, bathed in lamplight, was the most beautiful being Psyche had ever seen. His face held perfect masculine beauty, skin smooth as polished marble, features balanced in divine proportion. His hair curled in golden ringlets around his face. His body was that of a young man in the absolute prime of youth, every muscle defined, every line elegant. And folded against his back were wings, magnificent feathered wings that shimmered with iridescence in the lamplight. Psyche realized with shock that her husband was not merely beautiful, he was divine. He was a god. The bow and arrows, lying near the bed, confirmed what she suddenly understood. She had been sleeping beside Eros himself, the god of love, the son of Aphrodite, one of the most powerful beings in existence. In that moment of revelation, as she stared at this impossible beauty, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she had been given and what she had nearly lost through mistrust, the lamp in her shaking hand tilted. A drop of hot oil fell from its reservoir, landing directly on Eros's shoulder. The god woke with a cry of pain, his hand flying to the burn. His eyes opened and met Psyche's. And in that gaze, she saw love and anger and betrayal, all mixed together. He understood instantly what had happened. She had broken the one condition of their union. She had allowed doubt to overcome trust. She had betrayed him. Eros leaped from the bed, his wings spreading wide. Before Psyche could speak, before she could apologize or explain or beg forgiveness, he launched himself toward the window. Psyche dropped the lamp and knife, rushing after him, her hand reaching out to grab his ankle. For a moment, she held on as he flew upward, allowing herself to be carried into the night sky. But her grip could not last. She fell, tumbling through the darkness, landing hard on the ground as Eros disappeared into the heavens. The god's parting words echoed in her ears. "Love cannot exist without trust," he had said. Faith was the foundation, and she had shattered it. He told her that no punishment he could devise would be worse than the loss of their love, that she would suffer far more from her own betrayal than from any curse he might lay upon her. Psyche lay where she had fallen, sobbing with a grief more profound than any physical pain. She had held paradise in her hands and let it slip away. She had been loved by a god, and threw that love aside for the poisonous words of jealous sisters. The magnitude of her mistake crushed her beneath its weight. When she finally dragged herself to her feet, she looked around and saw that the palace had vanished. The meadow was empty. No invisible servants sang. No music played. Everything had disappeared with Eros's departure, leaving her alone in an ordinary field beneath an indifferent sky. Psyche's grief quickly transformed into determination. She would find Eros. She would prove her love was real. Stronger than her moment of doubt, she would perform any task, face any danger, endure any suffering to win him back. With this resolution burning in her heart, she set off on a journey that would take her across the world and beyond. But before she could search for Eros, she had one grim errand to complete. She returned to the homes of her sisters, those vipers who had poisoned her mind with their lies. She told each of them, separately, that Eros had chosen to marry another after dismissing her. She suggested, with false sorrow, that if either sister wished, they might take her place. All they had to do was go to the cliff where Psyche had first been abandoned and leap into the air, calling for Zephyrus to carry them to Eros's palace. Both sisters, driven by their greed and jealousy, did exactly as Psyche suggested. Each went alone to that high cliff, threw herself into the void, and called out for the west wind to bear her up. But Zephyrus did not come. No supernatural force caught them. They simply fell, their bodies dashing against the rocks far below, meeting the death their wickedness had earned. With that dark justice done, Psyche began her true quest. She wandered from land to land, searching for any trace of her lost love. She came to temples dedicated to the goddesses Demeter and Hera, begging each in turn for their assistance. Both goddesses felt sympathy for the girl's plight, moved by the obvious sincerity of her love and the depth of her remorse. But neither dared to interfere in the affairs of Aphrodite, whose jealousy of Psyche had ignited this entire tragedy. To help Psyche would be to make an enemy of the goddess of love. And that was a risk neither deity was willing to take. Psyche realized that she had no choice but to confront Aphrodite directly. If she could not find Eros, perhaps she could reach him through his mother. Perhaps, if she proved herself worthy, if she demonstrated her devotion through action rather than words, the goddess might relent and allow their reunion. It was a desperate plan, fraught with danger, but Psyche had nothing left to lose. Meanwhile, Eros himself lay recovering in his mother's palace. The burn from the lamp oil was not the only wound he nursed. His heart ached with betrayal and loss. He had given Psyche everything, asked only for trust, and she had chosen doubt instead. The pain of that betrayal cut deeper than any physical injury. He remained in his chambers, refusing food, speaking to no one, lost in his grief. Aphrodite had quickly learned of her son's injury, and more importantly, of his relationship with Psyche. Her rage at this discovery knew no bounds. Not only had her son failed to carry out her command to curse the mortal girl, but he had actually fallen in love with her, had married her, had lavished upon her riches and comfort that made a mockery of Aphrodite's intended punishment. The goddess's fury was volcanic. Her desire for revenge intensified 1,000-fold. When Psyche finally presented herself at Aphrodite's temple, throwing herself on the mercy of the goddess, she found no compassion waiting for her. Aphrodite looked upon this mortal girl who had stolen her worship, who had seduced her son, who had dared to reach above her station, and the goddess smiled a smile that promised nothing but suffering. Aphrodite seized Psyche by the hair and dragged her through the temple, beating her, mocking her, heaping verbal abuse upon her head. The goddess called her a worthless slave, an ugly creature hardly worthy to lick the ground where divine feet had walked. She summoned her attendants, worry and sadness, and commanded them to torture Psyche further, to make her understand the consequences of offending an immortal. But physical pain was not enough for Aphrodite's vengeance. She devised something more refined, more cruel. She would set Psyche tasks, impossible challenges that no mortal could hope to complete. When Psyche inevitably failed, Aphrodite would have justification for any punishment she wished to inflict. And if, by some miracle, the girl succeeded, well, there would always be another task, harder than the last, until Psyche's spirit finally broke. The first task seemed simple enough on its surface, though its true difficulty became apparent immediately. Aphrodite led Psyche to a great storehouse where an enormous pile of mixed seeds reached nearly to the ceiling. There were wheat grains and barley, poppy seeds and chickpeas, lentils and beans, all jumbled together in a mountain of confusion. Aphrodite commanded Psyche to sort this entire mass, separating each type of seed into its own pile, and to complete the work before nightfall. Then the goddess departed, leaving Psyche alone with this impossible task. Psyche stared at the mountain of seeds in despair. There were millions upon millions of individual grains. Even if she worked without pause, even if she never stopped for a moment's rest, she could never sort them all in the time allotted. The task was designed for failure. She sank to the floor, overwhelmed by the hopelessness of her situation, and began to weep. But Psyche's plight had not gone unnoticed. A small ant, one of the countless insects that make their homes in the corners and cracks of human buildings, had witnessed the goddess's cruelty. This tiny creature felt pity for the suffering girl. Ants, after all, understand something about impossible labor, about tasks that require the cooperation of many to accomplish what one alone never could. The ant hurried away to summon its colony. Soon, thousands upon thousands of ants came streaming into the storehouse. They swarmed over the mountain of seeds, each insect taking a single grain in its mandibles and carrying it to the appropriate pile. The ants worked with astonishing speed and organization, their collective intelligence accomplishing in hours what would have taken a human years. They separated wheat from barley, poppy from chickpea, lentil from bean, creating ordered piles from chaos. By the time Aphrodite returned at sunset, expecting to find Psyche collapsed in failure, she instead discovered the task completed perfectly. Every seed had been sorted. The piles stood in neat arrangement. Aphrodite's eyes narrowed with suspicion and anger. She knew Psyche could not have accomplished this alone. Some power had assisted her. The goddess refused to acknowledge the completion as a success, insisting that Psyche must have received help, that the task, therefore, didn't count. But she could not deny that it was done. The next morning, Aphrodite devised a second task, one she was certain no mortal could survive. She sent Psyche to a valley where a flock of golden-fleeced sheep grazed beside a rushing river. These were no ordinary sheep. They were sacred to the sun god, their wool spun from actual gold, their temperament savage and violent during the heat of the day when the sun's rays filled them with aggressive energy. Aphrodite commanded Psyche to bring back some of their golden fleece. Psyche made her way to the valley and saw the sheep grazing on the far side of the river. Even from a distance, she could see that they were enormous, their horns sharp, their movements aggressive. Other travelers had warned her about these creatures. During the day, particularly at noon, when the sun stood highest, the sheep became murderous, goring and trampling any creature that approached them. Many had died trying to obtain their precious fleece. As Psyche stood on the riverbank, trying to gather courage for what seemed certain to be a fatal attempt, she heard a gentle voice. It came from the reeds growing along the water's edge. The river god himself, moved by compassion for this suffering mortal, spoke to her through the whispering plants. He warned her not to approach the sheep during the day. Their violence in sunlight would guarantee her death. But if she waited until evening, after the sheep had left the riverbank to find shelter for the night, she could safely gather the golden wool that they left clinging to the thorny bushes they passed through. Psyche followed this divine advice. She waited, resting in the shade until the sun began its descent toward the horizon. The sheep, growing calm and drowsy as the heat faded, moved away from the river to their nighttime grazing grounds. When they had gone, Psyche walked carefully along the bushes that bordered their paths. There, snagged on thorns and branches, hung tufts of golden fleece, glowing in the twilight. She gathered an armful of the precious wool, enough to satisfy even Aphrodite's demands, without ever having to confront the dangerous animals directly. When she returned and presented the golden fleece to Aphrodite, the goddess's fury grew even more intense. Again, Psyche had succeeded where she should have failed. Again, some divine power had intervened to help her. Aphrodite's beautiful face twisted with rage. She would not be thwarted by this persistent mortal girl. She would devise a task so dangerous, so impossible, that no amount of help could allow Psyche to survive it. For the third task, Aphrodite pointed to a distant mountain peak, so high that its summit disappeared into the clouds. From that peak flowed a waterfall that fed the river Styx itself, the boundary between the living world and the realm of the dead. The water of this stream was sacred and terrible, so cold it could freeze the soul, so potent that it had made the hero Achilles invulnerable where it touched him. The cascade fell down sheer cliffs, inaccessible to any mortal creature. The rocks themselves were said to be alive, ready to push away any climber. Dragons guarded the approaches, and the water's divine nature meant that anyone who touched it without permission would suffer immediate death. Aphrodite handed Psyche a crystal flask and commanded her to climb to the very source of this deadly stream and fill the container with its water. The goddess smiled as she gave this command, certain that she was sending Psyche to her death. No mortal had ever accomplished such a feat. The task was simply impossible. Psyche began the climb, her heart heavy with the certainty that this would be her end. The path grew steeper and more treacherous with every step. The air grew thin and cold. She could hear the roar of the waterfall above her, could feel the malevolence of the living rocks beneath her feet. When she finally reached a point where she could see the cascade itself, thundering down from impossible heights, she understood that Aphrodite had finally succeeded. There was no way to reach that water. The cliffs were sheer, the rocks rejected her touch, and even if she could somehow scale the impossible heights, the dragons circling above would surely destroy her. As Psyche stood frozen in despair, contemplating her final failure, a shadow passed over her. She looked up to see an eagle, enormous and majestic, circling above her head. This was no ordinary bird. It was the sacred eagle of Zeus himself, the king of gods, the bird that carried thunderbolts for the mightiest of all divinities. The eagle had been watching Psyche's trials with interest. The bird remembered that Eros had once done Zeus a favor, assisting in one of the king of gods' many romantic conquests. Zeus owed Eros a debt, and perhaps helping the god's beloved wife would repay that obligation. More than that, the eagle recognized in Psyche's persistent courage something worthy of admiration. This mortal refused to surrender, even when faced with certain death. Such determination deserved assistance. The great bird swooped down and plucked the crystal flask from Psyche's hands with its talons. Then it soared upward, flying to heights no human could ever reach, past the circling dragons who dared not attack Zeus's sacred messenger. The eagle flew directly to the source of the deadly stream, dipped the flask into the cascade, and returned to place it, now filled with the sacred water, back into Psyche's grateful hands. For a third time, Psyche returned to Aphrodite with a completed task. The goddess's rage had now transcended mere anger, becoming something closer to madness. How could this insignificant mortal continue to succeed? What power protected her? Aphrodite paced back and forth, her divine mind racing, trying to conceive of a task so terrible, so absolutely impossible, that even the intervention of helpful gods could not save Psyche. Finally, Aphrodite smiled, and that smile was more terrifying than her anger had been. She had thought of the perfect task, one that would require Psyche to journey beyond the mortal realm entirely. The goddess pointed downward, through the floor, through the earth itself, toward the underworld that lay beneath the roots of the world. Aphrodite commanded Psyche to descend into the realm of the dead and seek an audience with Persephone, queen of the underworld. She was to tell Persephone that Aphrodite had exhausted herself caring for her wounded son, that the strain had diminished her divine beauty. She needed to borrow some of Persephone's beauty to restore herself. Psyche was to bring back a small box containing some of that beauty, sealed and unopened. This task was death itself. To reach the underworld, one had to die. The living were not permitted in that realm. Even if Psyche somehow found an entrance, even if she descended into those depths, she would never be allowed to return. The laws of death were absolute. What goes down does not come back up. Aphrodite had finally devised a task that would rid her of this persistent mortal once and for all. Psyche understood immediately that she had been sent to her death. There was no hope of success. This was execution disguised as a task. She walked through the city in despair, her mind searching for the quickest, least painful way to enter the realm of death. She came to a tall tower and decided that throwing herself from its height would be the simplest solution. She would die in the fall, and then, being dead, she could enter the underworld and at least complete part of her task before being trapped there forever. She climbed the tower's stairs and stood at the top, looking down at the ground far below. She gathered her courage to jump, but before she could throw herself over the edge, the tower itself spoke to her. Towers, being tall enough to see far and standing long enough to hear much, sometimes gained a kind of wisdom. This tower had witnessed many deaths and did not wish to see another. The tower told Psyche that there was another way. In a certain remote location in Greece, there existed a cave that led down to the underworld, a path that the living could take if they were brave enough and careful enough. The tower provided detailed instructions. Psyche would need to bring 2 coins to pay Charon, the ferryman who carried souls across the river Styx. She would need 2 cakes made of honeyed barley to throw to Cerberus, the 3-headed dog who guarded the underworld's entrance. And critically, she must resist helping anyone she met along the way, no matter how much they pleaded for her assistance. This last warning was crucial. The underworld would test her compassion, her kindness, her natural desire to help those in need. She would encounter a lame man leading a lame donkey who would beg her to help gather sticks that had fallen from his load. She must refuse and pass by. She would see dead hands rising from the river Styx, begging her to pull them into Charon's ferry. She must not reach out to them. An old woman weaving would ask for her aid. She must deny that request as well. These were traps, the tower explained. Distractions designed to make her drop the cakes or lose the coins or otherwise fail in her mission. She must harden her heart, ignore all pleas for help, and focus only on her task. And most importantly, once Persephone gave her the box containing borrowed beauty, she must not, under any circumstances, open it. Psyche descended from the tower with this knowledge, gathered the necessary items, and set off for the cave that would lead her to the realm of the dead. She found the entrance exactly where the tower had described, a dark opening in the earth that exhaled cold, stale air that smelled of earth and endings. She descended into the darkness, following the narrow path that wound deeper and deeper into the earth. The light from the surface faded quickly, replaced by a dim, sourceless glow that seemed to come from the rocks themselves. The air grew colder. The sounds of the living world, birds and wind and running water, faded away, replaced by an oppressive silence broken only by her footsteps and breathing. She encountered the lame man with his donkey, just as the tower had warned. His pleas were pitiful, his need seemingly genuine. Every instinct in Psyche screamed at her to help, but she remembered the warning and walked past, her eyes forward, her heart hardened by necessity. She heard his curses following her down the path, but she did not turn back. She reached the river Styx, that dark water that separated the living from the dead. The river was wide and still, its surface black as obsidian, reflecting nothing. Souls of the recently dead crowded the near shore, waiting for Charon to ferry them across. When the ancient ferryman arrived, his boat creaking, his face hidden beneath a dark hood, Psyche held out one of her coins. Charon took it without a word and allowed her to board. As they crossed that dark water, dead hands did indeed reach up from the depths, their fingers grasping, their voices pleading for rescue from whatever torment held them in the river's cold embrace. Psyche gripped the sides of the boat and looked straight ahead, though tears streamed down her face at the sound of their suffering. She could not help them. To try would be to doom herself. On the far shore, Cerberus waited. The massive three-headed dog that guarded the entrance to Hades' realm was terrifying beyond description. Each head was the size of a horse, filled with teeth like swords. The creature's bark shook the very stones. But Psyche remembered her instructions. She threw one of the honeyed barley cakes past the dog. All three heads turned to follow the food, and while Cerberus devoured the treat, she slipped past and entered the underworld proper. The realm of the dead stretched out before her in all its gray, sad vastness. Millions of shades, the pale ghosts of the dead, wandered through fields of asphodel, living out their afterlife in a twilight existence that was neither pleasant nor painful, simply endless. Psyche walked through this land of shadows, asking directions from the shades, making her way toward the palace where Hades and Persephone ruled. The palace of the underworld's king and queen was magnificent in its way, but it was a cold magnificence, all black marble and silver adornments, beautiful but unwelcoming. Persephone sat upon her throne, a crown of pomegranate flowers upon her dark hair. She was beautiful, but melancholy, a goddess who spent half the year in this dark realm and half in the world above, forever torn between two worlds. When Psyche presented herself and explained Aphrodite's request, Persephone regarded her with eyes that had seen countless souls pass through her realm. The queen of the dead recognized the mortal girl's courage and determination. She knew the full story of Psyche's trials, for the dead speak of everything that happens in the world above, and news travels fast in the underworld. Persephone called for a small box, ornately decorated, and placed some of her divine beauty inside it, sealing it carefully. She handed it to Psyche with a warning that echoed the tower's earlier caution. Under no circumstances should Psyche open the box. Its contents were for Aphrodite alone. If Psyche opened it, she would face consequences beyond imagining. Psyche accepted the box gratefully and began her return journey. She made her way back through the fields of asphodel, past the palace, toward the river. She threw her second barley cake to Cerberus, distracting the beast long enough to pass. She paid her second coin to Charon for passage back across the Styx, and slowly, step by laborious step, she climbed the long path back toward the surface world. As she climbed, as the light from the world above grew brighter, as she smelled fresh air and heard the distant sounds of birds, a terrible thought began to grow in Psyche's mind. She was about to face Aphrodite again, and she was about to be reunited, perhaps with Eros. But she had been through so much. She had suffered so many trials. She had descended into the very realm of death itself. She must look terrible, haggard, aged by her ordeals. What if Eros saw her and found her beauty diminished? What if all her trials had been for nothing, because she no longer appeared lovely enough to deserve his love? The box she carried contained divine beauty, the loveliness of a goddess. Surely just a tiny bit of that beauty, just enough to restore what she had lost during her trials, wouldn't be missed. Persephone had surely placed more than enough in the box for Aphrodite's needs. Just a little for herself would hurt no one. The rationalization grew stronger with every step. She had come so far, survived so much. Surely she deserved this small reward. Her hand tightened on the box. Her fingers found the seal. And there, just steps away from the surface, from the completion of her final task, Psyche made the same mistake she had made before. She gave in to curiosity, to doubt, to the desire to control her own fate rather than trust in the outcome of her faithful service. She opened the box. There was no beauty inside. Or rather, there was the beauty of Persephone, which is the beauty of sleep, of rest, of the stillness that comes after life ends. A deep, death-like slumber poured out of the box like smoke, enveloping Psyche completely. She had time for one gasp of horror, one moment of understanding her terrible mistake. And then she fell. The box tumbled from her nerveless fingers. She collapsed on the path, her body crumpling, and lay as still and lifeless as the corpses that filled the underworld below. She had come so close. She had survived every trial. She had proven her love and courage beyond any reasonable doubt. And yet, in the final moment, she had failed again. Not through malice or cruelty, but through the very human failing of doubt and desire for control over her own destiny. But Psyche's story, unlike so many Greek tragedies, does not end in death. Because while she had been undergoing her trials, while she had been sorting seeds and gathering fleece and descending into the underworld, Eros had been recovering. His burn had healed, and as his body mended, so too had his heart. He had time to think about what had happened, to understand that Psyche's moment of doubt did not erase the love they had shared. He remembered the happiness they had known in their dark nights together. He remembered her laughter, her intelligence, her kindness. More than that, he had heard about her trials. News of Aphrodite's cruel tasks had spread throughout Olympus. The gods gossiped about everything, and Psyche's courage had become legendary. Eros learned how she had refused to give up, how she had faced each impossible task and found a way to succeed. He understood that she was proving her love through action, demonstrating a devotion that went beyond words or promises. His anger melted away, replaced by admiration and renewed love. He realized that her moment of doubt had been understandable, even forgivable. After all, he had asked her to trust him while keeping his identity hidden. The secrecy had served a purpose, but it had also created the conditions for mistrust to flourish. Both of them had made mistakes. Both of them deserved a second chance. When Eros heard that Psyche had descended into the underworld and was even now returning with Persephone's box, he knew he could not wait any longer. His wings spread wide, and he flew from Olympus, searching for her along the path he knew she must take. And he found her lying motionless on the ground, the open box beside her, the sleep of death heavy upon her. Eros knelt beside her body, his heart breaking anew at the sight of her pale face. But he was the god of love, and love has power even over death. He carefully scraped the death-like sleep from her skin, gathering it back into Persephone's box and sealing it once more. Then he took an arrow from his quiver, the smallest, finest arrow, and pricked Psyche gently with its point, using his own power to awaken her as a lover's kiss might wake a sleeping beauty. Psyche's eyes fluttered open. The first thing she saw was Eros's face, no longer hidden by darkness, but visible in the full light of day. He was as beautiful as she remembered from that single glimpse by lamplight. But now his expression held no anger or betrayal, only relief and love and joy at her awakening. Eros lifted Psyche into his arms. He told her that she had suffered enough, proven herself beyond any possible doubt. He forgave her completely for her moment of betrayal, asking in turn for her forgiveness for his anger and abandonment. She wept and held him, and they remained like that for a long moment, reunited at last, understanding now what their time apart had taught them both. But Eros knew that their troubles would not end simply because he had forgiven her. His mother's rage remained, and Aphrodite's power was considerable. More than that, the fundamental problem still existed. He was an immortal god, and Psyche was a mortal woman. Even if they overcame every other obstacle, time itself would separate them. She would age and die, while he remained forever young. Their love, however deep, seemed doomed by the very nature of their different existences. Eros made a decision. He flew to Olympus, to the palace of Zeus himself, king of gods, ruler of heaven and earth. He threw himself on Zeus's mercy, presenting Psyche's case with all the eloquence he could muster. He described her trials, her courage, her unshakable devotion. He explained how she had earned the right to be his wife, not through birth or divine favor, but through her own choices and sacrifices. And he begged Zeus to grant her immortality, to make her a goddess so that they could spend eternity together. Zeus listened to Eros's plea with interest. The king of gods was not known for his fidelity to his own wife, Hera, and he had caused countless tragedies through his romantic pursuits of mortals and goddesses alike. But he recognized genuine love when he saw it, and he was moved by Eros's passionate advocacy for his wife. Moreover, Zeus recognized the political advantage of granting this request. It would bind Aphrodite's son closer to Olympus's power structure, and it would demonstrate Zeus's magnanimity and power to elevate mortals to divine status. Zeus agreed. He summoned all the gods to Olympus for a formal assembly. Aphrodite was commanded to attend, and though she came with fury still burning in her heart, she could not refuse the direct order of the King of Gods. Psyche was brought before the divine assembly, a mortal standing among immortals, trembling but unbowed. Zeus addressed the assembled deities. He spoke of Psyche's courage and endurance. He noted that she had completed tasks that would have defeated many minor gods. She had proven herself worthy of elevation to divine status. And more than that, Zeus argued, her story demonstrated something important. The gods needed to remember that mortals were not merely playthings for divine amusement. Humans had souls, minds, hearts capable of great love and nobility. Psyche's very name meant soul, and she had proven that the human soul could be as enduring and valuable as any god's power. Then Zeus called for Hermes, the messenger god, to bring forth a cup of ambrosia, the divine nectar that granted immortality. He handed the cup to Psyche and told her to drink. She raised the cup to her lips and drank deeply, feeling the golden liquid burning its way through her mortal body, transforming every cell, every atom of her being. Her mortality fell away like a shed skin. She felt her consciousness expand, felt divine power flowing through her veins. She was becoming something more than human, something eternal. When the transformation was complete, Psyche stood before the assembly no longer as a mortal woman, but as a goddess in her own right. Wings sprouted from her back, matching those of her divine husband. She glowed with an inner light that rivaled even Aphrodite's beauty. Zeus proclaimed her a goddess of the soul, protector of that spark of consciousness that made each being unique and valuable. Then Zeus turned to Aphrodite. The king of gods fixed the goddess of love with a stern gaze and commanded her to accept this union, to welcome Psyche into the divine family, to end her persecution. Zeus's word was law on Olympus. Even Aphrodite, powerful as she was, could not defy a direct command from the king of gods. Aphrodite's expression was complex, Rage still simmered there, and jealousy, but also something that might have been grudging respect. Psyche had proven herself in ways that few could claim. She had endured the goddess's worst cruelties and emerged not just surviving, but triumphant. Perhaps, Aphrodite thought, a woman who could withstand such trials might actually be worthy of her son. Perhaps this mortal-turned-goddess would prove a suitable daughter-in-law after all. The goddess of love and beauty gave a stiff nod, acknowledging, if not quite accepting the situation. It was enough. Zeus declared the matter settled. A divine wedding would be celebrated, properly this time, with all Olympus in attendance. The wedding of Eros and Psyche became the stuff of legend. All the gods assembled, bringing gifts beyond mortal comprehension. Apollo played his lyre, creating music that made the very stars dance in the sky. The muses sang in perfect harmony. The Graces decorated the hall with flowers that bloomed in colors never seen on earth. Dionysus provided wine that tasted of pure joy. The feast was magnificent, course after course of foods both earthly and divine, flavors that mortal tongues had never experienced and never would. Eros and Psyche stood at the center of it all, hand in hand, their wings folded together, their eyes locked on each other. They had traveled such a difficult path to reach this moment. They had made mistakes, both of them. They had betrayed and been betrayed, abandoned and been abandoned. But through it all, their love had endured, had grown stronger, had transformed from the simple passion of their dark nights together into something deeper and more resilient. The gods raised their cups in toast after toast. Even Hera, Zeus's long-suffering wife, offered her blessing to the union, perhaps recognizing in their story a love that had been tested and proven in ways her own marriage never had been. Athena praised Psyche's wisdom in persisting despite impossible odds. Artemis honored her courage. Hephaestus, the god of craft, presented them with wedding gifts of his own making, items of such beauty and utility that they drew gasps from the assembly. After the feast, after the music and celebration, after the blessings and the gifts, Eros led Psyche to the chamber that would be theirs for eternity. No darkness hid them now. They could see each other fully, completely, with no shadows between them. And in that seeing, in that complete vulnerability and trust, they came together not as good and mortal, but as equal partners, two divine beings united by a love that had survived every test fate could devise. From their union, a child was born. A daughter they named Hedone, whose name means pleasure. She was the living embodiment of their love, the joy that comes from connection between souls. In some traditions, Psyche and Eros had other children as well, but Hedone is the most significant, representing the offspring of love and the soul, the pleasure that emerges when these two fundamental forces combine. The story of Eros and Psyche offers multiple layers of meaning, depending on how we choose to interpret it. On its surface, it is a beautiful fairy tale about love conquering all obstacles. A mortal woman wins the heart of a god through her beauty, loses him through doubt, and wins him back through courageous action. It contains all the elements of the best stories: jealous villains, impossible tasks, divine intervention, and ultimate triumph. But deeper meanings shimmer beneath that surface narrative. The name Psyche, meaning soul, transforms the story into an allegory about the soul's journey. In this reading, the tale becomes about how the soul must undergo trials and tribulations to reach its divine destination. Psyche's descent into the underworld mirrors the soul's descent into the body, into material existence. Her tasks represent the spiritual work required to purify the soul. Her ultimate transformation into a goddess represents the soul's potential for divine transcendence, for becoming something more than merely human. The relationship between Psyche and Eros takes on additional significance in this allegorical reading. Love and soul must find each other, must unite despite the obstacles that keep them apart. Their initial relationship, conducted in darkness, represents imperfect union, love without full knowledge or understanding. Psyche's betrayal, her decision to look upon Eros in the light, represents the soul's inevitable fall into doubt and separation. But this fall is not final. Through effort, through trials, through persistent devotion, the soul can reunite with love. And this time, the union is complete, conducted in full light, with full knowledge, with full equality. Aphrodite's role as the antagonist becomes more interesting in this light. She represents, perhaps, the possessive, jealous aspect of love, the love that seeks to control and punish rather than liberate. Or she might represent the material world itself, which tests and challenges the soul, creating obstacles that seem insurmountable, but ultimately serve to strengthen and refine. Her tasks for Psyche are not merely punishments, but transformative experiences, each one teaching Psyche something essential about herself and her capabilities. The assistance Psyche receives from nature, from ants and reeds and eagles and towers, suggests that the universe itself conspires to help the soul in its journey. This is not a story where the protagonist succeeds through her own power alone. Psyche survives because she is willing to accept help, because she listens to advice, because she recognizes that some challenges cannot be faced in isolation. There is wisdom in knowing when to accept assistance, when to trust in powers greater than ourselves. Yet Psyche's great flaw, appearing twice in the story, is her inability to trust completely. First, she lights the lamp, doubting that her invisible husband could be good. Then she opens the box, doubting that she is beautiful enough without enhancement. Both times, her lack of faith leads to disaster. Both times, she must be rescued from the consequences of her doubt. The story seems to suggest that trust, that leap of faith beyond evidence and proof, is essential to love and to spiritual growth. But we should not be too harsh on Psyche for her failures. Her doubts are deeply human, understandable, even rational, given the circumstances. Her sisters did lie to her, but their lies found purchase because Eros had created a situation where doubt could flourish. The requirement that she never see his face, never fully know him, was always going to create problems. Perfect trust without knowledge is difficult to maintain. And opening Persephone's box, while technically disobedient, stemmed from a desire to be worthy of the love she had fought so hard to reclaim. Her mistakes show her humanity, and it is precisely that humanity, that capacity for error, combined with capacity for growth, that makes her story meaningful. The evolution of Psyche's character throughout the tale is remarkable. She begins as passive, a beautiful object worshipped but not known, isolated by her very perfection. When the oracle condemns her to marry a monster, she accepts this fate with resignation. Even in her relationship with Eros, she initially remains somewhat passive, accepting the rules he establishes, living in the palace he provides. But her betrayal of his trust, while wrong, marks the beginning of her agency. She chooses to act, even though that action brings disaster. And from that point forward, she becomes the driver of her own story. She pursues Eros. She chooses to face Aphrodite. She completes the tasks despite their impossibility. By the end of the tale, Psyche has transformed from a passive beauty into an active hero, earning her divine status through her choices and actions. Eros, too, undergoes transformation. He begins as his mother's obedient servant, willing to curse Psyche on Aphrodite's command. His accidental self-wounding represents a crucial turning point. The god who had always controlled love from a distance, who had never been subject to his own power, suddenly experiences what he has inflicted upon countless others. He learns what it means to be vulnerable, to lose control, to be consumed by desire. His decision to disobey his mother's command demonstrates moral growth, a willingness to follow his heart even when it conflicts with filial duty. His establishment of the secret marriage, while problematic in its secrecy, shows an attempt to protect what he loves. He creates a paradise for Psyche, provides for her every need, and shares himself with her as fully as he can within the constraints he believes necessary. When she betrays him, his anger is understandable, but so is his eventual forgiveness. He recognizes that love requires not just passion, but also compassion, not just desire, but also understanding. By the end of the story, Eros has matured from his mother's obedient son into an autonomous being, capable of making his own choices about love and commitment. The relationship between Eros and Psyche offers a model for understanding the integration of different aspects of the self. Psyche's initial inability to see Eros symbolizes the unconscious nature of love and desire, while her eventual acceptance of him represents the integration of these forces within the psyche. In psychological terms, their union can be understood as the marriage of consciousness and unconscious, of rational thought and instinctual desire, of the ego and the deeper self that Jung called the anima or animus. The tale of Eros and Psyche can be seen as a metaphor for the journey of the human soul toward fulfillment and integration, where Eros represents desire not just in the romantic sense, but as the fundamental life force that compels the soul to grow and seek completion. This interpretation positions their story as fundamentally about the process of becoming whole, of integrating the disparate parts of ourselves into a unified, authentic being. The trials Aphrodite imposes take on deeper significance when viewed through this lens. Each task requires Psyche to develop specific qualities essential for psychological maturity. The sorting of seeds demands discrimination, the ability to distinguish and organize the chaos of experience into meaningful categories. The gathering of the golden fleece requires understanding of natural rhythms and cycles, patience to wait for the right moment to act rather than rushing forward recklessly. The collection of water from the sticks demands the courage to attempt the seemingly impossible, while also requiring the humility to accept help when offered. The final trial, the descent into the underworld, Psyche does alone, for the journey to awakening consciousness is often made in darkness, and the soul is better equipped for the journey having assimilated the qualities symbolized by the different animals. This descent represents the most profound psychological work, the confrontation with death, with endings, with the shadow aspects of the self that we prefer to keep hidden. Every spiritual tradition recognizes that transformation requires a kind of death, a letting go of old identities and securities to make room for new growth. The helpers who assist Psyche throughout her trials reveal another crucial truth about personal development and spiritual growth. We do not accomplish such transformations in isolation. The ants represent the power of community and cooperation, the understanding that some tasks require collective effort. The reed by the river embodies the wisdom of nature, the guidance available to us if we learn to listen to voices beyond the purely rational. The eagle symbolizes vision and perspective, the ability to see from heights that transcend our limited earthbound viewpoint. And the tower represents accumulated human wisdom, the knowledge passed down through generations about how to navigate life's most difficult passages. Psyche's willingness to accept help demonstrates an important quality that our modern culture often undervalues. We live in a time that prizes individual achievement, self-reliance, independence. But the myth suggests that true strength includes knowing when to ask for assistance, when to listen to advice, when to allow others to contribute to our success. Psyche survives not because she is invulnerable or supremely capable, but because she remains open to guidance and grateful for aid. Yet the myth also acknowledges the limits of external help. Psyche's two great failures, lighting the lamp and opening Persephone's box, occur despite all the assistance she receives. These mistakes stem from internal flaws, from the doubt and vanity that no amount of external support can eliminate. She must confront these aspects of her character herself. No helper can prevent her from making those crucial errors. And in a sense, those errors are necessary. They teach her lessons that success alone could never provide. The opening of Persephone's box carries particular symbolic weight. Beauty from the underworld is not beauty in the conventional sense, not the surface attractiveness that caused all of Psyche's initial problems. It is the beauty of death, of completion, of the stillness that comes when striving ceases. Psyche's desire to enhance her appearance before reuniting with Eros reveals that she has not yet fully learned the lesson her trials were meant to teach. She still believes that external beauty matters more than the internal transformation she has undergone. Her death-like sleep represents the consequences of this final failure of understanding. She comes so close to success, survives so much, only to fall at the last moment through the same combination of doubt and vanity that caused her initial betrayal. It is a deeply human moment, one that resonates because we recognize in it our own tendency to sabotage ourselves just when victory seems within reach. How often do we undermine our own happiness through patterns of thinking and behavior that we cannot seem to break, even when we know better? But the myth does not end in tragedy, because Eros chooses forgiveness over justice, love over pride. His rescue of Psyche demonstrates the transformative power of grace, of receiving more than we deserve, of being loved despite our failures. This is perhaps the most radical message of the entire story. We do not earn love through perfection. We do not deserve divine union through flawless performance. Instead, love itself bridges the gap between what we are and what we might become, providing the grace necessary for our transformation. Eros's appeal to Zeus represents an important acknowledgement that some problems require intervention from beyond ourselves and even beyond our immediate relationships. Zeus, as king of gods, represents the highest authority, the power that can fundamentally alter the rules governing existence. His decision to grant Psyche immortality changes her nature at the most basic level, solving the seemingly insurmountable problem of the mortal-immortal divide. The gift of immortality Psyche receives is not presented as something she earns through her trials, but rather as a gift given out of love and mercy. Zeus is moved by Eros's plea, touched by the evidence of Psyche's devotion, and convinced of the rightness of elevating her to divine status. This represents a kind of grace, a transformation that comes not from personal achievement, but from being recognized and valued by powers greater than ourselves. Psyche's transformation into a goddess completes her journey from passive object to active subject, from mere mortal to divine being, from isolated individual to integrated member of a larger community. She becomes a goddess of the soul, a protector and patron of that spark of consciousness that makes each being unique. This is fitting, given what her name means and what her story has demonstrated about the soul's capacity for growth, transformation, and transcendence. The divine wedding that concludes the story represents the sacred marriage, that mystical union that appears in spiritual traditions around the world. It is the marriage of heaven and earth, of spirit and matter, of divine and human, of masculine and feminine principles. All the gods attend because this union has cosmic significance beyond the personal happiness of the two individuals involved. It represents a fundamental healing, a restoration of proper relationship between different aspects of reality that had been separated. Aphrodite's eventual acceptance of Psyche as daughter-in-law suggests that even the most bitter resentments can be overcome, that reconciliation is possible even in the most difficult family dynamics. The goddess who had tormented Psyche so terribly comes to acknowledge her worth, perhaps recognizing that anyone who could survive such trials and still love her son deserves respect. This reconciliation is important because it suggests that wholeness requires integrating even those aspects of ourselves and our experience that seem most hostile and destructive. The birth of Hedone, whose name means pleasure, represents the fruit of their union, the offspring of love and soul joined together. This is not the cheap pleasure of momentary gratification, but the deep pleasure that comes from authentic being, from living in alignment with one's true nature, from the union of consciousness with its deepest desires. Hedone symbolizes the joy that emerges when we achieve integration, when the warring parts of ourselves finally find peace. The enduring appeal of this myth across more than 2,000 years testifies to its ability to speak to fundamental aspects of human experience. We recognize ourselves in Psyche's beauty that isolates rather than connects, in her loneliness despite being surrounded by admirers, in her doubt about the love she receives, in her willingness to endure any trial to reclaim what she has lost. We understand Eros's dilemma of loving someone his family opposes, of trying to protect a relationship by keeping parts of himself hidden, of being wounded by betrayal, while also recognizing his own role in creating the conditions for that betrayal. The story offers hope because it insists that love can survive betrayal, that trust can be rebuilt after it has been shattered, that mistakes do not have to be final. This is a profoundly redemptive message in a world where relationships often seem fragile, where one mistake can end everything, where forgiveness seems weak rather than strong. The myth of Eros and Psyche argues that true love is resilient enough to survive our failures, patient enough to allow for growth, and generous enough to extend grace when we fall short. In our contemporary moment, when romantic relationships are often approached with a consumer mentality, when dating apps reduce potential partners to swipeable profiles, when commitment seems increasingly difficult to sustain, this ancient story offers an alternative vision. It suggests that genuine love requires more than initial attraction or compatibility. It demands trust, even in darkness, persistence through trials, willingness to be transformed by difficulty, and the courage to remain open and vulnerable even after being hurt. The myth also speaks to our individual journeys of self-discovery and personal growth. Each of us must sort the seeds of our experience, distinguishing what is valuable from what is merely distracting. Each of us must learn when to act and when to wait, when to be bold and when to be patient. Each of us must develop the vision to see beyond immediate circumstances, the wisdom to accept help when it is offered, and the humility to acknowledge that we cannot complete our journey alone. We each must make our own descent into the underworld, confronting death in its various forms, facing the darkness within ourselves, retrieving the treasure that can only be found in the depths. And we each must resist the temptation to open the box, to think that external enhancements can substitute for internal transformation, to believe that we can control outcomes through manipulation rather than trusting in the process of growth. The story reminds us that transformation is rarely comfortable. Psyche suffers tremendously throughout her trials. She experiences betrayal and abandonment, exhaustion and despair, isolation and fear. The path to wholeness is not easy or gentle. It demands everything we have and then demands more. But the myth insists that this difficulty serves a purpose, that we grow through our struggles rather than despite them, that the very trials that seem designed to break us actually forge us into something stronger and more complete. Artists throughout history have been drawn to this myth, creating countless paintings, sculptures, operas, ballets, poems, and novels inspired by Psyche and Eros. The moment of Psyche lighting the lamp has been depicted hundreds of times, capturing that instant when curiosity overcomes caution, when desire for knowledge trumps obedience to authority. The reunion of the lovers, particularly in Antonio Canova's famous sculpture showing Eros reviving Psyche with a kiss, has become an iconic image of love's power to restore and redeem. These artistic responses demonstrate that the myth contains a visual and emotional power beyond its narrative structure. The image of Psyche, holding the lamp over the sleeping god, captures a universal moment of revelation when we finally see the truth we have been avoiding. The image of her descent into the underworld resonates with anyone who has had to face their deepest fears. The image of her transformation into a goddess, growing wings that match her lover's, embodies the hope that we can transcend our limitations and become something more than we were. Writers from many traditions have retold and reimagined this story, each finding in it elements that speak to their own cultural moment and personal concerns. C.S. Lewis wrote a brilliant novel called Till We Have Faces that retells the myth from the perspective of one of Psyche's sisters, exploring themes of jealousy, faith, and the different ways people understand and experience the divine. His version complicates the simple good versus evil structure of the original, giving depth and humanity to characters who were merely villains in Apuleius's telling. Modern retellings have explored feminist interpretations, asking whether Psyche's story represents female empowerment or female subjugation. Some readers see her as a hero who earns her divinity through courage and persistence. Others see her as a victim of patriarchal structures who must prove herself worthy of male approval. Both readings have validity, and the richness of the myth allows it to support multiple, even contradictory interpretations. Psychological and spiritual thinkers have found endless material in this tale. Freudian and Jungian thinkers saw Psyche's path as a metaphor for psychological growth, a process of individuation, emotional struggle, and integration of the unconscious embodied by Eros. Carl Jung wrote extensively about the sacred marriage, that alchemical union of opposites that appears in dreams, myths, and spiritual visions across cultures. He saw in the story of Eros and Psyche a perfect illustration of the individuation process, the journey toward wholeness that he believed was the central task of human psychological development. The myth has also been interpreted through spiritual and mystical lenses. From an allegorical standpoint, the soul wants to purify itself and be beautiful in order to merge with the beloved, understood as God, like in Sufism or Christian mysticism, where she is a drop that longs after the ocean. This interpretation sees Psyche's journey as the soul's quest for union with the divine, with each trial representing a stage of spiritual purification necessary before that ultimate union can occur. The four tasks in particular lend themselves to spiritual interpretation. Sorting the seeds represents discrimination between spiritual truth and worldly illusion, the development of discernment that allows us to distinguish what matters from what merely seems important. Gathering the golden fleece symbolizes the acquisition of spiritual treasure, wisdom that comes not from aggressive pursuit, but from patient waiting and harmonious relationship with natural rhythms. Collecting water from the sticks represents the courage to approach the boundary between life and death, to confront mortality and derive spiritual strength from that confrontation. And the descent to the underworld represents the dark night of the soul, that period of spiritual desolation that mystics across traditions describe as a necessary stage on the path to enlightenment. The prohibition against opening Persephone's box takes on particular resonance in spiritual interpretation. The desire to enhance oneself, to add something extra, to improve upon the simple grace of divine love, represents a failure to accept that we are already enough, that the transformation has already occurred, that we need add nothing to what has been given. This is perhaps the most difficult lesson in any spiritual tradition, the recognition that seeking itself can become an obstacle, that trying to improve ourselves can prevent us from accepting the grace that is freely offered. In the context of understanding love and relationships, the myth offers several crucial insights. First, it insists that genuine love requires knowledge of the beloved. The initial relationship conducted in darkness, however passionate, was fundamentally incomplete. True intimacy demands seeing and being seen, knowing and being known. This means accepting risk, because being fully known includes revealing our flaws and vulnerabilities. But the myth suggests that this risk is necessary for authentic connection. Second, the story demonstrates that love involves more than feelings. Psyche's emotions for Eros remain constant throughout her trials, but those feelings alone do not constitute a complete relationship. Love requires action, demonstrated commitment, willingness to endure difficulty for the sake of the beloved. Her journey proves her love in ways that words or feelings never could, showing through behavior what mere declaration could not capture. Third, the myth acknowledges that relationships require forgiveness and grace. Both Eros and Psyche make serious mistakes. Both betray the other's trust. Both cause genuine harm, yet they find their way back to each other because they choose forgiveness over grudge holding, understanding over judgment, love over pride. This is perhaps the most practically useful lesson the story offers, recognizing that all relationships will include failures, and that the capacity to forgive and rebuild trust separates sustainable partnerships from those that shatter at the first serious conflict. Fourth, the tale insists that true partnership requires equality. The initial relationship was fundamentally unequal, with Eros as divine master and Psyche as mortal dependent. Only after she becomes a goddess can their union be complete and permanent. This suggests that lasting love requires partners who are equals in some fundamental sense, who can meet each other at the same level rather than one forever serving or submitting to the other. Finally, the myth recognizes that love itself is transformative. Psyche does not remain the passive beauty she was at the story's beginning. Her love for Eros changes her, challenges her, forces her to grow and develop in ways that would never have occurred otherwise. Similarly, Eros evolves from his mother's obedient son into an autonomous being, capable of defying authority for love's sake. Their relationship transforms both of them into something more than they were separately, creating a union that is genuinely greater than the sum of its parts. The naming of their daughter, Hedone, pleasure, suggests something important about the nature of true happiness. In contemporary culture, pleasure is often pursued directly, as though it were something that could be grasped and held through an act of will. We seek experiences, purchase products, cultivate lifestyles, all in service of maximizing our pleasure. But the myth suggests that genuine, lasting pleasure is not something we can pursue directly. Instead, it emerges as a byproduct of right relationship, of souls united in love, of consciousness aligned with desire, of heaven and earth married in sacred union. This insight has profound implications for how we approach our lives. If pleasure is indeed the child of Eros and Psyche, the offspring of desire and soul properly united, then we cannot find it by chasing after it directly. We find it by doing the difficult work of integration, by undertaking the trials that transform us, by building relationships based on genuine knowledge and trust rather than illusion and control. The pleasure that comes from such work is deeper and more sustainable than any gratification we might pursue more directly. The story ends with Psyche and Eros living happily ever after. But this is not the empty promise of fairy tales that everything will be perfect from this point forward. Their happiness is earned through struggle, proven through trial, made possible by transformation. They have learned to trust each other despite betrayal, to love each other despite mistakes, to remain committed despite difficulty. This kind of happiness can sustain itself because it is grounded in reality rather than fantasy, in knowledge rather than illusion, in acceptance of imperfection rather than demand for flawlessness. As we reach the conclusion of this tale, we might ask ourselves what Psyche and Eros's story means for our own lives. Are we willing to undergo the trials necessary for genuine transformation? Can we sort the seeds of our experience, distinguishing what truly matters from what merely seems important? Do we know when to act boldly and when to wait patiently? Are we humble enough to accept help when it is offered? Can we find the courage to descend into our own underworlds, to confront the darkness within us, to retrieve the treasures that can only be found in the depths? And in our relationships, are we willing to be truly seen? Or do we hide in darkness hoping to be loved without being known? When we make mistakes, when we betray trust, can we find the courage to try again? To prove our love through action rather than merely declaring it with words? When others hurt us, can we choose forgiveness over revenge, grace over justice, love over pride? The myth of Eros and Psyche offers no easy answers to these questions, but it provides a framework for thinking about them, a story that illustrates both the difficulty and the possibility of transformation through love. It reminds us that the soul's journey is never simple or straightforward, that we will make mistakes along the way, that we will face trials that seem impossible to overcome. But it also insists that these trials serve a purpose, that our failures can teach us, that love has the power to redeem our mistakes and transform our very nature. In the end, perhaps the greatest gift this ancient story offers is hope. Hope that love can survive betrayal. Hope that trust can be rebuilt. Hope that we can become more than we are. Hope that the soul's journey, however difficult, leads ultimately to union with what we most deeply desire. Hope that pleasure, genuine and lasting, emerges from the marriage of love and soul, from the union of our conscious choices with our deepest nature, from the integration of all that we are into something whole and holy and complete. The story of Eros and Psyche has endured for more than 2,000 years because it speaks to truths that transcend any particular culture or historical moment. It addresses the fundamental human experiences of love and loss, trust and betrayal, trial and transformation, death and rebirth. It offers a vision of what we might become if we have the courage to undertake the journey, the persistence to complete the trials, and the faith to believe that love itself will provide what we need to reach our destination. So as you drift toward sleep tonight, carry with you the image of Psyche and Eros reunited, their wings folded together, their love proven through fire and darkness, their union blessed by all the gods. Remember that you too contain a soul capable of divine union, that you too can undertake the journey from mortal limitation to something approaching the eternal, that you too can sort the seeds and gather the fleece and descend into darkness and emerge transformed. Remember that genuine pleasure comes not from seeking it directly, but from the right relationship of soul and desire, from the marriage within yourself of all that you are and all that you might become. The story ends, but its echoes continue. somewhere in the eternal now of myth, Eros and Psyche dance at their wedding feast, while the gods look on in blessing. Their daughter, Pleasure, plays at their feet. The lamps are lit. No darkness remains between them. And they see each other truly for the first time. This is how the story ends, but also how it begins again with each person who hears it, with each soul that undertakes its own journey toward integration and wholeness and love. May your own journey be blessed. May you find helpers when you need them, courage when trials press upon you, forgiveness when you fail, and grace when you succeed. May the marriage of love and soul be consummated in your own heart, and may you discover, as Psyche did, that the pleasure that comes from such union is worth every trial, every tear, every dark night of doubt and fear. If you enjoyed this journey through one of mythology's most beautiful love stories, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support allows us to continue exploring these ancient tales and discovering the timeless wisdom they contain. Share this story with someone you love, someone who needs to hear that transformation is possible, that love can survive betrayal, that the soul's journey, however difficult, leads ultimately to joy. Until next time, sleep well, dream deeply, and may the stories we share continue to echo in your heart long after the telling ends.